Bubp joining us today. He's one of the 3 artists that's featured in our Spaces Between exhibition, along with Tim Stone and Lynn Benson. This exhibition will be up through January 3rd, so we would love it if you could come in and check it out. Again, we're always free and open to the public Wednesday through Sunday from 11 to 5. We're also pretty excited to be doing or testing out some new technology today, which will allow us to have Robert talk about his pieces within the gallery space, and we'll follow him around and hear more about the really exciting installations that he has created for us here. And if you have any questions, you can either submit them in the comments on Facebook Live, or if you're watching us with Zoom, submit them in the chat, and then I will ask them to Robert when we get to that point in the conversation. But with that, I will hand it over to Robert.
Thank you, Gretchen. Thank you. Thank you so much to the Salina Art Center for hosting this really interesting exhibition. It's quite a treat to be here with these other artists and even the new shows that have opened up just recently, and what's going in the next space. They look really exciting. So I really want to extend a big thank you to the staff at the Salina Art Center, and especially Gretchen and Ruth Moritz, who helped put this together. And one of the things that this really did that I was really excited about was I had an opportunity to rethink my artistic practice a bit and what I was going to do for this exhibition, because of the changes to not only what was going on, the dramatic events happening in our public spaces over the summer, but also my ability to access that, how I was going to work, since my work has been largely about developing a walking practice, so to speak, where I document my movements in relationship to things that are happening in shared spaces in different cities around the world and different places. And for the last 5 years, I've been embarking on that project, where I would go to different places like New York, Los Angeles, Mexico City, and I will engage with those spaces and walk through them, come upon what I come upon, and kind of document things that I consider to be kind of disruptions or dissonances to the everydayness of public space. And that could be as small as somebody skateboarding in the wrong place, or it could be street vending, it could be a protest, it could be a festival. Any of those things I would kind of document and put myself in the center of it as being experiencing this this sort of shared space, and making sure that I was part of that and wasn't just turning my lens, so to speak, on everybody else, but that I was part of this too. For example, there was one point in Mexico City where I was witness to a protest, and one of the protesters had a fist raised, and as he walked up to me, he also shared his middle finger with me, kind of letting me really remember that I was not just a passive participant pointing a camera, but that I had a political presence, and I had as an American tourist, and I had a guest presence, and and I have an actual formal presence in the sense of actually being there and not being some sort of unseen entity behind the lens. So that process that I've been doing for the last few years is one that has turned into a piece like this. So this work is called Geologic, which is why I've made all these series, frankly, and then give it a subtitle. Social disruptions on the Mexico City Metro. And this was created in 2018. So what's going on here is this is a map of Mexico City, and it's made out of metal, and there is acrylic paint on it, and it is etched with acids, and there's the brown parts. You're seeing a roofing tar, and wanting to have this thing look a little bit like something that could have been dug up. It's a sense of understanding that mapping is also about a certain type of power. And the power in sort of articulating this information is what is being articulated, how is it being used. And because this is information that is sort of under the radar, that is not well known, and it's also personal to me, it has a kind of secretive, not real obvious quality to it. And I've always want to make these pieces seem like they could have been unearthed, like they could have been dug up from under the ground, archaeological in a sense. So in this case, all of these lines are actually the Mexico City map lines for the metro system, the train system. And I have, every time I noticed some kind of unusual activity on there, which mostly took the form of people selling small items actually on the train itself, I marked them off with these circles that I then rusted. Almost all of that would happen on the west side of Mexico City, or I'm sorry, this is actually the east side, the southeast side of Mexico City, because the west side is actually the really wealthy area. Some of the most wealthy people in Mexico live in this area right here. So what's happening there is really kind of me noticing these things and articulating the way that this kind of alternate economy works, where people who don't have a lot are selling things for not a lot to other people who don't have a lot. And this informal economy is something that happens all over the world. We don't see it as much in the US because in large part the US has really tried to eradicate any kind of informal economy like this, and it does have a way of creating a sort of political othering and marginalizing of people that use the streets in this way. So because I didn't want to just be a passive observer to this, to these issues, I actually also developed a series of t-shirts that would have slogans on them that I would then give away to anyone who wanted one that would come to a show, or sometimes I would do a kind of performance where I would put the t-shirts, set up a space, often in Hutchinson, Kansas, I did this right in the middle of the town, where I would then give the t-shirts away to anyone who would pass by for a certain amount of time. So this table that we've got here is kind of meant to be in the way that it would be on the street. It's spreading out all over so that when you walk in the gallery, you kind of have to negotiate around the space of the table. It's presented in a very sort of informal workshop kind of way, and the t-shirts are very sort of direct. They have messages that are really about what I consider to be like public space ethics, in a sense, how we interact with shared space. It is, taking a position in that sense, but you would hope that these are positions that wouldn't be terribly controversial. I mean, one of the ones I did most recently says, "Except we share the air," and on the back of it, it says, "Don't reject, my mask protects you, your mask protects me." Obviously, this message is a little bit more important now than it would have been when I first started this project a few years ago. The first t-shirt that I ever did, and have been giving away I've given away at this point several hundred of these, says, "Accept, tolerance, love, respect, equality for all." And the back of it says, reject racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, hatred toward minorities, immigrants, LGBTQ persons, or any other persons for reasons of identity, race, or gender. So this one has actually been rather popular. I've given away quite a few of these through different exhibitions and performances over the last several years. If you come to the show, you can actually take a t-shirt if you're so inclined to have one, because the point of that, I think, is to kind of make this into what I would call a performative artwork, in the sense that rather than the artwork strictly sitting in a gallery and being looked at, and experience this in some way through my lens, where I've gone to this place and I've documented this information and had these experiences. This is a way of creating something that's very simple and easy to kind of, in the message, simple in the message, and easy to kind of connect to, that if you're interested in taking one, you take it and it sort of fans the artwork out into everyday life, that I find really compelling, because a lot of what I want to do is about everyday life and everyday experiences, but how this turns up in a gallery space later on is really down to the fact that you're looking at what I've done after the fact, not so much the everyday in this moment. So what I really like about this project, as simple as it is that it can create another direction. Rather than looking at something that happened in the past, we're looking at something now that we can imagine would be seen by people wearing these things out of the future, taking them and extending it out. So it has a different face in a sense of how we understand what the artwork is, in the sense of how it's made and what time frame it exists in. Because these things only exist really in the sense of, well, they have a past in that the t-shirts were made. They have a present in that they're here now, and they have a future in a way that other artworks don't, in that they are going to go out into other spaces. And I have also been collecting photographs of people wearing them in those spaces, and at some point when I have, accumulated a lot of them, I'm probably going to make an installation of sorts of photographs of people wearing them in those places, so that there's a sense of the massiveness of the mass of people who have taken these and are participating in that conversation about public space ethics. They are that becomes evident in the sense of the document of them being photographed. So if you're ready, I think I've said what I want to say on that. Yeah, keep me apprised of the time, of course, so I don't.
Oh, you're doing good.
Am I doing okay?
Yeah.
There's a little bit of light in here too. Come around and look at these.
You want me to turn the volume down on the video for a little bit, or?
I'd like it to be up for now, and then maybe after we talk about the video, then it can go down. Okay, so in this room, the work that I've made in this room is recent, and this is what I was talking about earlier, that the work in here is actually how I had to think about things differently in relationship to the things that were happening during the summer and also the quarantine period that we had in March and April, and who knows, hopefully we're not going back into that significant of a shutdown. I know we all want to avoid that, but that really affected me personally, in the sense as not only personally, in really being at a point where I was kind of feeling like, what matters in terms of art? I've got this show coming up in Salina. What am I going to do that seems like it's going to pertain to any of this at all? And I guess it's kind of ironic that all the things happened in the summer with the Black Lives Matter protests. But, and I couldn't really process exactly how to make this matter to me and to anyone else, largely because we were having to stay inside. So, and I couldn't travel. So I didn't really I got to one of those protests in Kansas City and couldn't go to these other places. So I did make this video that's largely about kind of being stuck in a feedback loop. It references the film Apocalypse Now, where the opening scene, the main character is trapped in a hotel room, kind of in this place where he wants to be out in the war, but he also doesn't want to be out in the war. And so, knowing that going out is unsafe, but staying in is also not really sound either. So the sense of the sound of the helicopter in that film is something that, and the circular nature of the helicopter blades is something that I drew a parallel with in the film, with seeing the ceiling fan inside the house, and walking outside the campus door and seeing at the university where I teach, and seeing the sprinkler going off in a circular way, which also happens to have a sound that's not that unlike the helicopter. The one protest I did go to in Kansas City, seeing the helicopters going around is what I focused on when I shot video. And then in this scene, what we're seeing right now is me taking my dog for a walk during quarantine period in a circle. So the whole thing is about being trapped in this loop where we have to experience space through screens, and experience public engagement with each other is experienced more through screens than it is necessarily in person. So in this work too, I've intentionally made it so that you can walk through the pieces I have now, and also another thing that I like about it is that it is set up in such a way where it goes into the corner and the shape of the video is distorted a little bit. And a happy accident that came out of that is someone pointed out to me that when you see the helicopters in these first scenes that are about to happen, because of the way I'm having to shoot them in the video, and then the way they go in this strange corner setup, the helicopters kind of look like they're bouncing back and forth, also sort of stuck in this loop of not being able to move forward, which was totally accidental, but I love it. and we'll be doing that again when I present this video in another show going forward. So at this point, if you have the ability to turn that sound off, or
The sound is fine.
it's fine?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right, good. And we can keep it up. So I didn't mention also that there was footage that I totally stole off of social media from Black Lives Matter protest in Portland. And part of the point of doing that was, again, that we had to experience so much of this through virtual processes, whether it's the news or Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or whatever you're using. A lot of this had to be taken in this virtual way. So toward that end as well, the mapping processes that I would normally use when I would go to a different place and experience these things firsthand, because this is really like what I do. And I love going to different places, for the travel, but I also really like the fact of being able to take things in on foot. Is a really different experience of a place, and you meet people, and sometimes those people don't want you to talk to them, and that's completely okay, because what I'm doing is unusual, and I always ask people for their permission for any kind of photographs or using their names or anything like that. And sometimes they really do want to participate in what I'm doing in this documentation process. But I couldn't go these places for the summer, so I decided to make a series of map pieces that is about other people participating in protests during the summer in their places. So I solicited information via Facebook for people who had gone to protests in different places around the country. And in one case, it's actually someone who was from Italy. And I got quite a few people volunteered their information, said I was on this protest at this date, and this was the location, and you can use my name. So out of all of those that I got, which was probably 20 or 25, I ended up whittling that down to 6 that I could do in time for the exhibition. And this is the result of what these look like. So in each of these cases, they are small towns, 5 of them in the US and the 6th one in Italy. And I wanted to focus on small towns largely because I felt like that speaks to how the Black Lives Matter protests, the George Floyd protests, they were so widespread across the country. It was this phenomenon that reached well outside of New York and Los Angeles and Chicago, and went into all these other places. So this one is from Savannah, Georgia. And and this one is Garden City, Kansas. And I had a person ask me at one point if each of these was the actual city limits of the town in question. And they actually all are, with the exception of Savannah. So Savannah is just the central squares, and it's actually built around 16 small park squares. And they're all identified on here in the main downtown core. I couldn't actually do Savannah very easily because the city limits are so unusual. They actually are not contiguous. So Savannah is like, here's part of it, here's part of it, and here's part of it. So I ended up just focusing on the main central part. The pink area, the green part is parks. The pink area is the downtown area in each of these respective places. And where the protest happened, I've rusted and drawn a blue circle around, and that's done with pencil. So you have tar on here, acrylic paint, and rust and pencil, and then there's also a transfer and that has the zip code for this particular place. And a lot of these places really only have one zip code because they're so small. So this one's Garden City, Kansas, And this one is Narrowsburg, New York. This one here is Annville, Pennsylvania. That one is Shawano, Wisconsin. And the last one is Udine, Italy. So Gretchen, can you think of anything that I should talk about that I haven't covered?
No, I think you did a great job. I do have some questions. We can remind everyone to submit questions if they have them.
Submit questions if you would like to, if you have them.
Yeah.
In the chat, right?
In the chat or in the comments on Facebook.
Or in the comments on Facebook. So submit your questions in the comments on Facebook.
I had a question about like social practice art in general, because
Yeah.
I know this is a really big part of your practice.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that? And I feel like it's something that museums are doing more of, and they're really interested in this. And how is it difficult to translate what you do as a social practice artist into something that fits within a museum setting?
Yeah, so Gretchen's question is about social practice art and how that translates into like a gallery or museum setting. And I think it's interesting, what I do is inherently social, but I define myself, and I think a lot of the scholarship I've seen define social practice art actually is something where the artist facilitates the creativity of a community in some way, or does artwork that especially benefits a specific community. I feel like out of this group of works, the thing that's closest to social practice art is the t-shirts, because in that sense, there's almost no real personal signature on that work in terms of style. And in fact, also the slogans are not all from me. One of them that I have on the t-shirt is from a John Lewis quote. And the design of the t-shirts was actually created by Samantha Miller-Gott, who was using that design for posters she was making to take to protests. And I consulted with her about if it was okay to use them on the t-shirts, and she said it was. And then they have oftentimes been printed by a local collective of artists called Brick Mob that are in Wichita. And so there's a community dimension in the way these have been created, and the idea of distributing them free of charge is part of the practice where the social is enhanced or facilitated through the artist's activities. So whereas the rest of my practice in terms of the walking and the mapping has this obviously social dimension to it, the way that social practice art I think has been defined has largely been meant to be by and for a specific community where the artist kind of takes a secondary status. I may get credit for that, but it's really oftentimes the other people in the community are making the work. So, but in terms of the challenges of putting this work up in a gallery space, for me in particular, a lot of times my work is, I do so many different things. It is a kind of like mix and match process, mixed media in the most literal sense. And there's a process that's being followed, but it isn't really obvious within the work. So for example, if I hadn't told you that these were from Black Lives Matter protests that people had told me about, you wouldn't really get it from the artistic object. You would have to know that information. And that kind of work, that process kind of work is hard to display in a context like this, because the process is not present in front of the artwork. And what you get in the end is results of the process. So the challenge in exhibiting that kind of work is in being able to provide enough context so that it can be fully reconciled and understood by the public that experiences it. That's why when I'm doing a show like this, I never miss an opportunity to talk about the work, because it's really important to cover those other elements that I just talked about so that the process is more apparent, because it enriches your ability to understand what's actually going on in the depth of the work beyond just the video and just the painting and just the t-shirts.
Awesome.
Yeah, we have other questions?
I do have one question about the maps in particular. The viewer was curious if you have ever been commissioned to make a map or asked to make a map of a specific area, or is it more just your gathering this information up?
Yeah, it's a great question. The question is if I've ever been commissioned to make a map, or if for another area, or if it's always been me going out on my own and gathering this up and doing my thing. And the answer is that it's almost always been me gathering my stuff up and doing it on my own, but I actually have been commissioned to make a work, and I have a piece that is on display right now. It was a public commission. It is still a work that is up. It's on. It's held by the University of Kansas. It's actually in a building on the Edwards campus in Olathe, Kansas, which is a satellite campus of KU. So for that particular work, I was commissioned to make a work that was a map-based work that was about somewhere relative to that area, which is Olathe, Overland Park, suburban Kansas City. What I did for that work was I looked into the history of that location, and I found that that particular place, suburban Kansas City, has a long history of different identifiable owners or claims to ownership, which means that it was originally Native American land, and then it was held and state claimed by several different tribes, including the Kansa, the Kaw, and also even the Black Bob Indians of that area. And there actually is a Black Bob Road, and the campus in question is very close to Black Bob Road. So that pertains to a tribe that was known as the Black Bob Indians. So it was part of Louisiana Purchase. It became Kansas itself. It's Johnson County. There are ghost towns. There are artillery plants like the Sunflower Munitions Company that don't exist anymore. So what I did for that piece was I kind of made a reverse history map of Johnson County, where the historic names that no longer were there were mixed in with the contemporary names. So it kind of questioned the idea of naming the land. In fact, I titled the piece Johnson County Names and Renames. So that was the one time I've been commissioned to make a map piece for a specific place and did a public commission. And if I hadn't had so much time invested in these other pieces, I would be doing a lot more of that actually, because I really enjoyed that project. And I've always thought like I really would like to do another public art piece that was along those lines, where I did something specifically for a place where I really had to investigate. I have actually been commissioned to pursue installations like this in specific places. So I did an installation much like this with video and the map pieces in Indianapolis back around 2010. And I actually did a piece in Salina that did not use the metal map pieces. That was also an installation and community practice project that was a lot more like social practice, because there was community investment in the work at that particular time. So yeah, I do take quote unquote commissions. I did another one like that in Corpus Christi, Texas. There were no metal map pieces in that piece either, but there were videos and drawings and a lot of community participation in that project too. Other questions?
Thank you. Yeah, I have a really great question.
Great.
Again, talking about social practice. As an artist, do you run into challenges with galleries not wanting to work with you because of the social practice aspect? And what advice would you give to artists who use social practice who find it hard to share their message?
Okay, so as an artist, have I ever run into situations where, because I'm working in social practice, galleries don't want to do what I am proposing? And what advice would I have for people who want to do that kind of work? Well, ultimately, what is really hard about the work I did here in Salina in 2008, and then did in Corpus Christi, Texas right after that, and also in Indianapolis, is that all three of those projects required a great deal of time spent in this community. So I drove back and forth to Corpus Christi, Texas a whole bunch of times. I had a 3-week residency there at one point, but I was there for 2 weeks another time. It's a 13-hour drive, I can tell you. You know, having done it many times, that's exactly 13 hours. That takes a lot of investment on the part of the space itself. So there's money and time devoted in planning because they have to help you do the project with the community in the sense of helping you get contacts and information and groups to work with and things like that. So there is a huge investment on the part of the institution. That is an impediment because they have to have a good, really want to do your project. And I found that that's a lot easier to do when it is talking about some kind of local project, because an institution is going to be more interested in having an artist come in and do something in their space, which is somewhat novel and maybe very timely and appropriate because of whatever's going on, as opposed to me taking my experience in some other place and putting it in another space where people don't have the connections and maybe don't care as much about what goes on in that town. My advice would be to do these projects as much as you can in your local area and do them with spaces that are willing to allow you to turn the gallery into a kind of performative space where there's no reason why you can't propose that we're going to have a group of people come in here and we're going to do a t-shirt making workshop in the space, and that's going to be the show. And they'll say, well, that's pretty weird. Why do we want to do that? I said, well, because you'll have people come into your gallery because they want to make a t-shirt because it's fun. And then you might say, I could also do this with a different audience that you normally bring in. Let's make some connections with people that don't always come here and see how we can do something that relates to them and facilitate that kind of conversation. But you can do those sorts of things in a lot of different spaces, and they don't necessarily even have to be museums or galleries so much as alternative spaces that are really sort of open-ended and willing to allow some trial and error to happen. And I find that's probably the way most artists who want to work that way are going to have to work when they're first starting, because spaces that are more established are going to be less likely to want to put that amount of resources behind really any artist unless they really have a lot of reason to do so, or a specific grant that covers it, or a curator who's invested in it, or some other kind of connection. I know when I was here in Salina in 2008, part of the reason that I came in to do the project I did was because there was a lot of conversation about downtown development and how there were changes where the whole town's growth was moving all southward. And I can say now, 12 years later, Salina looks a lot different than it did then. But there was a whole bunch of people who were quite invested in having the kind of work that I was doing, which at the time, which was really about a shared vision for community space and how the development could be impacted by that. It was really largely about envisioning the future of a community in that sense. And that's part of the reason why they were interested in having me come and work with that. And it took a lot of work. I must have met with 30 or 40 different groups of people in Salina at that time. And the whole thing took about 2 years to complete. So it takes a lot of investment on the part of the institution. Anything else?
Great. I had another question, and I don't know how, it's probably a long question, but I know like you and I have had conversations particularly about artists using maps, like, you know, situationists and other groups who have either made maps or manipulated maps or somehow tried to change how maps operate.
Right.
And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about this idea kind of within art history, within your work. And I know we've talked about this idea too of like who makes the maps and how that affects what's shown.
The question is about like who makes the maps and what implications that has, and what are the challenges of being involved with that. And that is a really good question, because for before I started doing this work in 2015, the map pieces that I was making was largely about spaces and cities, and they weren't really about anything related to individuals. And the ethics of that, when I started doing work that was much more personal in terms of me in this space and other people, the ethics of that is really, really tricky because you don't want to be a person who is mapping other people because that has so many historical problems. If you know anything about redlining, where they actually weren't mapping people, but in a way they were, when the banks and realtors were getting together to identify parts of town that they thought were higher risk for housing loans, and those parts of town almost always had a certain kind of racial character. That's an example of the kind of mapping that's being used for really negative abuses of power. And that is really the thing, is that mapping is a tool that is about power. And for me, what I always have to remember is mapping my own movements, because mapping everybody else is really not a very appropriate thing to do. And even when I mentioned in the Mexico City map that was mostly people that I had seen on the subway, you know, I'm actually pretty reluctant to put that in the title because, and I'm always make sure that I characterize the fact that this map is me moving all around this place and things that I noticed along the way. And whatever those things are and who those people are will always remain, you know, will not be divulged, because that would be, you know, brightening the corners on people who did not authorize that, which is inappropriate. The difference here with this work, I think, with the BLM protests, is that this was solicited through a public, well, semi-public Facebook post asking people if they would be interested in passing along this information about their own activities. And I felt like that was above board, because what we're doing there is they're volunteering to give me this activity, and they know through conversations that I'm going to make a map of it, and I've asked them if it's okay to use their name, and they have said yes. So in that sense, the concept of self-mapping is less problematic, because, and what that does in some way is invert what the history of mapping is. And I would also mention that mapping hasn't always been used for nefarious purposes. The Europeans did not invent maps. Maps were used by indigenous communities. The Aborigines in Australia were using maps 60,000 years ago. And what they were doing oftentimes was making identifiable. I visited one in Australia and I was there, a 10,000-year-old carving into a rock at the beach that basically was an identifying location map to show what kinds of fish you could catch in that part of the water. So this concept of mapping is being used in a negative way for, you know, a long time. It hasn't always been used in a negative way. And in some cases, it is possible to take that power relation. I think it's possible to take that power relation and sort of turn it in against itself, and sort of map things that the power structure doesn't want to have mapped. And that includes being willing to put oneself in that position, and maybe take the embedded privilege of being a traveler and turn it back in against oneself, in the sense of only shooting videos of your feet and mapping your own movements, as opposed to other people's, mapping other people. So, yeah, that's great.
I have a memory challenge for you now.
Okay, challenge.
You were talking about the project that you did here in 2008, and I have a question. Is Salina turning out the way people thought in 2008?
Man, I mean, the question is Salina turning out the way people thought in 2008? Yes, yes. The way the people that I talked to wanted to have happen, and I gotta say, in that process, in the interest of being an unbiased observer who doesn't just reflect back the opinions of some to the opinions of some, you know, preaching the converted, I did hear people in Salina who didn't care that all the development was going southward. I mean, those people existed. They were totally fine with that. and were excited that there was going to be a water park on the south side and some other things that were going on. That was troubling people who were more concerned about the condition of the downtown and especially the north side, which had really been somewhat neglected. And I haven't gone through the north side very much. It doesn't look to me quite as challenging of a state as it was in 2008, and I don't know if that's true or not because I haven't looked at it too much. But in terms of the downtown core really transforming itself in the way that most people wanted, that is absolutely happening. It looks great, and I've commented on this to many people that I have talked to about this show here, that my opportunity to come back here as much as I have recently has really helped me to see how much progress Salina is making on making itself into a really terrific built environment, as well as it always was a cool community, or you wouldn't have the Salina Arts Center. But making it itself into a built environment in the downtown core that is highly visitable and worth spending time in for sure. And really aesthetically interesting too. The bridge, what do you call those structures that are over the street? I mean, just putting those grates on and the colored lights to spruce them up so well, and I've seen that there was a big vacant lot up on the north part, and that's been filled in with the Kenny's Alley Entertainment Complex. And there's a lot of conversation about what to do with that. Yeah, there's a lot happening. It's good.
Great, you passed that quiz.
All right, did I pass?
I have one more question, and I think this is a pretty good one too. So, and we can move around if you want. As you've seen your art, as you've seen your work in the gallery alongside the work of the other two artists, what connections have you made in relations to your own work?
What connections have I made with my work alongside the other two artists in relationship to my work? What connections have happened with that? That's a pretty fantastic question. I think that it's more obvious between myself and Lynn Benson, because Lynn's work has this abstract quality, and she is kind of documenting mapped images of river plains, and I'm doing that too, and I have references to water, and I have these irregular shapes that could only come from the landscape. And there's a similarity in the sense that we're both engaging with the inner relationship of humans with the environment. And in my case, it's like the urban and political environment, political meaning mapping boundaries and streets and things like that, in the sense of man-made constructed boundaries and places. And in her case, the relationship of the man-made to the natural. And you can see that there's interesting similarities even in the way the work looks, especially in terms of my maps and her paintings. I think a great example of that is how when you walk in the main space, the Mexico City map I've made is right next to a piece of hers where the installations coordinator, Gretchen, has made this amazing choice where she put these two pieces next to each other, and you can see this really, really poetic similarity in the way that the surfaces reflect each other in a lot of ways and are similar. And it really is the kind of thing that you hope a curator will see, and this is why you do group shows, because they have the ability to make these comparative things that makes your work look more interesting than maybe it was to begin with. And that's part of why it's important to do a group show like this. With Tim's work, I think the similarities are apparent in that he's really interested in urban space, and he's interested in the politics of that to a dimension, and also he's interested also in climate change, which is not something that you see in my work, although you could read it into that if you want to, in terms of like using, these the sort of degraded surfaces that you see. You could take that to mean that it was something related to that, or it's not intended. In Tim's work, it definitely is intended, and it speaks to the idea again of having the man-made be something that's up for interrogation, and how it relates to individuals and how they reconcile their space. He's doing it imagistically and creating these things that really explore what's real and what is not real. You know, he uses the word fake, what's real and what's fake, and how the nuances of those images and our culture of images kind of go through this process of us trying to figure out what's really happening and what's a faked happening, what's even a photoshopped thing. So in that sense of it being this dialogue between how we experience these spaces and places and what's real and fake, that's very true. And for me, it's even more true now, because this work, having been largely created from screen-based experiences rather than direct experiences, has a conceptual connection to what Tim does, more so than it may have in the past, I think. So.
Perfect, thanks. I think we'll wrap it up.
Yep.
I just want to say thanks everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Robert. I thought that was really great. And join us next month again, December 16th, for our Lunch and Learn with Rachel at Buller, again on Facebook Live. And that's all I have.
Well, thank you so much, everyone who joined us. Appreciate it. Have a great day. Come back next week. Month. Come back next month.
Well, they can come in next week.
Yeah, you can come in next week. Yeah.
All right, thank you.